Welcome back, everyone. We have another really interesting episode today. I'm really excited to talk to Nafees because he comes from such an unusual background, one that I think you wouldn't probably associate with free speech, but I'm going to let him tell you all about it. And first, just introduce you to my co host, Chris. Also, my co founder with 1776 Forward. And if you haven't yet caught any of our episodes, which you should, we've got quite a nice back catalog building up now. If you haven't yet, you should know that this podcast it's produced by our organization 1776 Forward in conjunction with the Institute for Liberal Values, and that's probably where you're finding this on their page. So we're always appreciative to them for the partnership, and also for they were actually our connection to Nafees. So let's get started for today's episode. Chris, why don't you tell us about Nafees?
Sure. And thanks, Joia. And hey, Nafees, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, for our audience, just some background on Dr. Nafees. He is an award winning professor of the 2022 Golden Apple Award, specializing in nonprofit program evaluation and macro practice with over 7 years of experience. Before academia, he worked in Wall Street's financial sector for over 7 years. Dr. Alam's research agenda is self-determination in sport social work, with a secondary focus on viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, and constructive disagreement in higher education. He has several publications and is presented at conferences worldwide, including 2 keynotes. He aims to disseminate ideas through many public platforms as a contributor to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, for those of you who know, Heterodox Academy, Inside Sources, Psychology Today, and Real Clear Education. He is passionate about global education through technology, teaching, and designing online courses taught globally, along with his YouTube channel and podcast geared toward an international academic audience. And we'll be sure to share those when we publish. So with that background, I'll just turn it over to you, Nafees. Why don't you tell us how you did come to standing up for free speech and being a leader in this field, or promoting liberal values more broadly?
Yeah, sure. So it all began. First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this conversation. I feel like we need to have more conversations like this to create spaces where it's safe for intellectual discourse. So really appreciate you both. So as far as my journey to the arena of free speech, it started back during my master's orientation way back in 2010. And what ended up happening was that the first reflection paper that I had to write was based on a selection called White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I believe it was Peggy McIntosh who wrote that. So it was about 26, 28, I forget exactly how many points of white privilege. And so in my reflection piece, my reflection to that paper, my argument was that most of these are not so much about white privilege, but rather green privilege, socioeconomic status. And I, true with any reflection piece, I use myself as an example. I've been fortunate to have grown up in an environment where my parents have been very successful, and I experienced many of those privileges that white privilege was meant to be for. So in that reflection piece, I talked about how, like, yes, there are elements where it's there are clear areas of white privilege, but by and large, I took that to mean that it was mostly green privilege.
Mm.
The worst grade that I had ever gotten in my entire academic career. Grammar was
That
okay.
didn't go over well, I guess.
No, no. The grammar was good, spelling was good. Again, English is my 4th language, so sometimes I still struggle with it. But yeah, after Bengali,
Wow,
Hindi,
4 languages. Okay.
yeah. So I was given the opportunity, and the comment was that you didn't get the spirit of the assignment. So I failed that assignment, but I was allowed to retry it because it's the first assignment, and they're not going to kick me out of the program after one submission. So, being the true social scientist prankster that I am, I wrote the same exact paper, same number of sentences, same citations, same references, except every position that I held on this side, I now held on that side. And, just essentially opposing myself.
Uh-huh.
This was back in the day when they would want to hang papers up with on a bulletin board, and they wanted to do that with my paper. after the resubmission.
Wow.
So that's when I realized, at least for that moment, I was being graded not on my ability to think for myself, but rather my ability to adhere to the orthodoxy of thought that exists in that particular discipline at that time. And that's what inspired me to be a professor. Before that, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So that was the moment where I was like, I need to be in higher education one day and teach people to understand different viewpoints and different perspectives. So throughout the remainder of my master's education and the start of my PhD, I cosplayed as someone who had certain ideas but wrote as though I had opposing viewpoints. And I had a pretty good, I had a 4.0 for my master's, and PhD, you only get grades for certain classes. Mostly it's just pass fail. But the classes that did get grades for, I think I ended up with like a 3.8.
Mm.
So and then I started coming out of my shell and started creating spaces for my students to understand that viewpoint diversity exists. Now, I can't we can't talk about this topic without mentioning the importance that if we see higher education as indoctrination in one direction, the solution is not indoctrination in the other. And
Right.
so creating a space for that has been my passion, and I'm hopeful to continue doing it for the next 4 decades.
One thing that really strikes me, even about your prankster paper stunt, is it sounds like you didn't even necessarily change the structure of the argument. So it sounds like there was nothing even then about the construction of the paper in that sense that was any different, let alone the grammar and the spelling, but literally just the viewpoint itself. That all that was changed was you went from one viewpoint to the other viewpoint. So tell us then more about viewpoint diversity and why you think viewpoint diversity and free speech are so important for an individual to flourish, for a university to flourish, for society as a whole to flourish.
I think competition is good for business, as the three of us have had some of us more than others experience in economics. Competition brings out the best in us, and me being a former athlete, competition brought out the best in me as well. If we are in an environment where there is no viewpoint diversity, we're not being challenged to think more critically, to think in a more advanced fashion. And I don't know that human intellectual evolution can continue to happen if we don't have environments where we feel challenged by each other's thoughts and challenged to think outside of the box, so that we redefine what the box is.
Mm. Given your perspective in academia, and I know you kind of are very, very precise in your language of viewpoint diversity, I'm curious how that concept even is viewed in academia these days. Like, do you feel you almost need to carve out that space and kind of draw those conceptual lines of distinction in order to even promote the value of free speech on campus, or like, is it seen as a pejorative by many of your peers?
Yeah, many of my peers see viewpoint diversity as a dog whistle to, I've heard that viewpoint diversity is a dog whistle to white supremacy. And then I sort of think to myself, just using the language alone, if you were to say that viewpoint diversity is an element of white supremacy, then what you're telling me is that diversity of viewpoints are etched out only for white supremacists, as though no other person and no other party could
Mm-hmm.
possibly, enjoy the fruits of viewpoint diversity. But most of these people outrank me, so I don't say that out loud. So I keep the thoughts to myself. I do write a lot, and at this point, I have enough of a public presence where if you Google me, you very clearly understand where I stand
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to that topic. But yeah, generally, it's been thought of as something that is unwelcome in spaces that are intentional toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. It would appear as though diversity and equity and inclusion are prioritizing race, gender, sexuality, but not sort of like the color of skin demographics, the superficial demographics, rather than the content of character demographics. To bring in MLK over here for just a moment,
Mm-hmm.
the way that we think isn't always shown by the way that we look.
Yeah. Simple me, I used to just think diversity equaled viewpoint diversity, that kind of was the essential quality of it. But I'm my question kind of belies that I'm aware that this distinction is unfortunately necessary in many academic contexts these days.
Well, and maybe it's our new battle cry, make diversity diverse again.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, I like
Yeah, I
that.
mean, because to your point, right? Like I think as Nafees was suggesting, like the idea that this could be white supremacy would mean that like everybody of a certain race then had to have the same viewpoint, or everyone of the same gender, sex, sexuality. I mean, ultimately, I think
Right, but which is
the
a form of
ultimate
race.
unit of viewpoint diversity is the individual, and it's like there's no space for individuality
Right,
within
right.
these groups, unfortunately. Well,
I mean,
I'd love to hear even more from Nafees about, because it sounds like you become such a strong advocate for viewpoint diversity, for applying critical thinking in your works and your papers and what you're trying to teach your students, to point out that these kinds of values perhaps go beyond just race. So I'm curious, like what you might say to one of these students who perhaps has only come up in an educational system where where the expectations were the expectations that were upon you, who perhaps don't even know if they were to even come on board with viewpoint diversity, wouldn't even know how to express themselves in that way. So can you say something maybe about like tools or techniques or practices that you recommend to students to help them perhaps find their individuality, to find their uniqueness in expressing their viewpoint?
sure. It's important to be practical with this sort of advice, and I have given it. It's been about almost a decade now that I've been doing this. So I go back to something that my high school coach, football coach, taught me, was that you got to learn to play the game before you change the game.
Hmm.
And what that means in this context is that, as a master student, I was at the bottom of the hierarchy. And yes, I had ideas that would challenge my professors, but I am there to get the best grade possible. And if challenging my professors would somehow equate to getting a lesser grade, then I wasn't about it. And I would imagine that most students, even in my classes, albeit I try to push the idea that, disagreement will not work against you in my class, and my class is, that might not always be well communicated, because generally it is the concept of, well, if my professor doesn't like me, then I'm going to get a worse grade.
Hmm.
So my advice has been, take the lessons not for what your professors are interpreting them to be. Rather, read the readings and review the lessons, and review out all the links, and maintain a critical eye to this. If your professor thinks that this is a great option for you to consider, a great resource for you to consider, using critical thinking, you have to wonder, well, what are some critical areas that make this not the best resource? So just thinking in that point counterpoint fashion. Whatever you think is good, tell me why someone else would think it's bad. Would think it's bad. So practicing that, but also at the same time, not going overboard with challenging, faculty members that might, implicitly have that bias, and take that out on a student with their grades. So for
Hmm.
those particular students, I tell them, you got to play the game before you change the game.
Hmm.
And this is my story, and if you stick to it, there is a happy ending at the end. It's
Hmm.
not out of the realm of the reality and possibility to get your PhD and be in an academic setting and really drive these sorts of concepts like viewpoint diversity, for example, and be a champion in that arena. But
Hmm.
indeed, you do have to learn to play the game before you change the game.
Yeah, I like that. It's a very tactical and strategic advice, but given your own experience, I can see why. So I mean, that's maybe a nice pivot to a question we love to ask all of our guests. But kind of as you think now that you're in a position where you have some security for your viewpoint diversity and have had time to mull this issue seriously, what would you invest in or kind of advocate champion as the most impactful initiative that could be undertaken if resources were no object to promote and advance free speech in the culture?
I think it starts early on, and I think it starts with the concept that understanding a viewpoint does not always have to come with agreeing with that viewpoint. And we can start in maybe second grade, third, fourth grade. I don't know anything about American education pre-second grade because that was the first. I was 7 years old when we came to the United States.
Mm.
But I think we can start early and not feeling ashamed of being wrong. I think assuming benevolence, the root of all of this orthodoxy comes from the concept that I can't be wrong. I feel
Mm.
ashamed when I'm wrong. And the more people that believe in what I have to say, that validates and further validates the position that I hold. I think we're being way too emotional with what should be intellectual. The best part of academia and being an academic is that today I can think one thing and tomorrow I can think something completely different, and that is the expectation. We are academics and not salespeople, in this particular context. So I think if we can teach teachers to understand that when you are challenged by your students, that is not an indication of them being provocative or adversarial. Perhaps this is a student's way of showing I want to learn more about areas of this topic that you haven't yet talked about,
Mm.
and I want to learn about it so much that I want to be able to disagree with your position on the topic. And I feel like as a professor, like I take a great deal of pride when students using the same resources that I've used, same theories, arrive at different conclusions than I have, and I'm like, this is exactly what
Mm.
education is about. Fine tuning thinking and being confident enough to communicate differences of opinion even with the people that have taught you. So if we can teach teachers, and that would take all the budget in the world, but if we can teach teachers not to be ashamed when students challenge their perspectives, and sort of welcome that sort of conversation, I think we could make a big difference that we'll probably feel in 2 or 3 decades once those young students turn into college students and future professionals.
Mm-hmm.
Your story resonates with me because it reminds me of one of my favorite professors that I had when I was an undergrad, who was my philosophy 101 professor. And one thing about this professor, it was the general education requirement. So we were learning about all different viewpoints and schools in philosophy. And one thing about this professor was nobody actually knew what his viewpoints were until the very last day of class. He
Mm.
finally shared some of his thoughts about the issues we've been talking about. But throughout the whole semester, he was made it a point to always try to present all sides of an issue and to present the best sides or the best case for all sides, so that throughout the whole semester none of us ever really knew what he actually thought until that very last day, when we were just kind of sitting around and having pizza and finally having a heart to heart and then actually hearing some of his thoughts. So I do love your suggestion, Nafees, and maybe you can say a little bit more about this, because one of the things that Chris and I are definitely passionate about with this project is helping people to find their voice, to stand up and have the courage to speak out for their views. And we recognize that that can be so difficult in the cultural atmosphere that we're all living in. As you're pointing out, that so many students, they grow up in an atmosphere where they feel afraid to speak out if there's a perception that they might be wrong. So can you maybe even say something that might help some of those students to
Yeah.
perhaps find that courage or be more okay with being wrong?
Yeah. It starts with being an American. I am a Bengali immigrant. I was born in Libya, during the time of Gaddafi communist regime. Lately, if you Google what's been going on in Bangladesh, just to summarize it quickly, there have been students that have been killed for,
Mm.
for speaking up for their rights. Just very recently, my father has been writing
Wow.
articles on this, so you could look him up as well. Being an American is in and of itself a privilege, and with that privilege comes a certain responsibility. And even this sort of contradicts what I just mentioned a moment ago about playing the game before you learn, change the game. We've already won by being Americans, in my opinion, just from an immigrant's perspective, because had I still been living in Libya or in Bangladesh, we wouldn't even be allowed to talk about the possibility of viewpoint diversity.
Mm.
So having that privilege and having that responsibility that comes along with it, and thinking about all of the people, if we take a more global perspective, all of the people that don't have the opportunity to speak up for the things that they believe in, hopefully we can draw some inspiration from that and say, you know what, maybe I haven't learned enough to play the game yet, enough to change the game,
Mm-hmm.
but I already know that this is wrong, and I might not be able to articulate it as well as someone with a PhD and a postdoc and a associate full professor and dean, and maybe I'm not able to speak with that much sophistication, but I know when something is wrong, and if my ideas are not allowed to be shared, then we all know that it's wrong. So speaking up and starting a movement and seeing who else is sort of feeling the same kind of way, because if you feel something, understand that there are other people in the room that feel that too, and they may not be ready to speak up until you do. But the problem there is someone has to speak up first in order for any movement to happen. You could be that person.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, Joy and I, we talk often about this notion of thinking aloud in public, and I really love the concept. It actually came from an essay that we reviewed, actually talked about on a Dissidents podcast episode with Elizabeth, our mutual friend and colleague. But um, I think it's key to this idea that you note about being okay with being wrong. I think so much of public discourse and even just individuals' discomfort or lack of confidence in speaking up comes from an insecurity or even a culturally ingrained sense that you need to know what you're talking about before you speak up. And, not only do I just think that's culturally bad and stifling, but I think it goes against even how we learn and communicate. So I think that is just a great principle for all of us to advocate. And it's certainly something that we are uh, core on advocating through this podcast and everything else we do. So, thank you for highlighting that. And don't be afraid to be wrong, I guess, is the message for everybody out there listening. If you have something to say and you feel it doesn't matter how inarticulate you may feel or unformed your education on the topic is. You have a voice and a right to say it. So,
Yeah.
so thank you.
Thank you. And, I appreciate all the work that you've been doing as well, both of you, in this regard. And I feel like, it's prime time for viewpoint diversity to be included in, what society perceives in the diversity, equity, inclusion sphere. And I think within the next 5, 7, maybe 10 years, I think that'll be, because it's so obvious that it can't not happen.
Yeah.
In fact, it would be I feel like it would be racist for it to not happen uh,
Yeah.
in some way,
Well,
So, yeah,
well, I'll go out on a limb and be a little bit more optimistic than you and say that I think it's going to happen in a lot less than 5 to 7 years. I feel like we're at a turning point, if you will, on a lot of these issues, or at least we've reached a critical mass. So that's certainly at least what we're trying to contribute to in our work, and appreciate your work on the same. So thank you for your time. That completes our episode for today. And thank you all for listening or tuning in. As always, you can find us linked on our website, 1776forward.com, or on ILV's website, ilvalues.org. All of their most podcast channels under the Dissidents podcast page. That's where you can find us for audio. And for Nafees, you can find him at his YouTube page is youtube.com/at Dr. Nafees Alam, NafeesAlam. And we'll be sure to put that in our posts as well. Thanks, Nafees. Thanks,
thank
Joy.
you. Appreciate you.
Take care.
Bye.